The sneer on Karl Rove's face lasted exactly 12 seconds before it began to dissolve into something approaching terror. The legendary Republican strategist had just made the fatal mistake of attacking Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's working-class upbringing, confident that her background would be a source of shame rather than strength. As silence filled the congressional hearing room and cameras captured every detail of his crumbling composure, America was about to witness the moment when elite political arrogance met authentic American resilience, and arrogance was utterly destroyed. Karl Rove had spent over 4 decades as the puppet master of Republican politics, the shadowy genius known as Bush's brain, who had engineered presidential victories and destroyed Democratic careers with ruthless precision. The 74-year-old Texas strategist had built his reputation on one simple principle: find your opponent's weakness and exploit it without mercy. His intellectual but condescending speaking style had intimidated countless politicians over the years, combining policy expertise with personal attacks designed to undermine opponents' credibility. As one of the most feared opposition researchers in American politics, Rove believed that everyone had vulnerabilities that could be weaponized, and that working-class backgrounds were particularly useful targets for subtle class-based attacks. Sitting across from him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 44-year-old Texas Democrat whose journey from housing instability to Harvard Law School to the halls of Congress had given her unique insight into both struggle and success. Unlike the privileged political operatives who populated Washington, Crockett had experienced firsthand the challenges faced by working families: the food insecurity, the housing instability, the constant worry about making ends meet. Her background as a civil rights attorney had taught her that personal attacks often revealed more about the attacker than the target, and that authenticity was more powerful than artifice. Today's hearing on campaign finance reform would prove to be the arena where Rove's decades of political manipulation met someone who refused to be ashamed of her origins, and where authentic American experience would triumph over elite political calculation. The congressional hearing on campaign finance reform and political ethics had drawn national attention as Democrats pushed for transparency in political consulting and campaign spending. The packed gallery included political operatives, journalists, and ethics watchdog groups, all recognizing this as a crucial moment in the ongoing battle over money in American politics. Rove's testimony had been a masterclass in political deflection, weaving together constitutional arguments and free speech rhetoric to defend the current system that had made him wealthy and powerful. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee," Rove began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had shaped American politics for decades, "the proposals before us today represent a fundamental misunderstanding of both the First Amendment and the practical realities of political communication." He adjusted his glasses with theatrical precision, his demeanor radiating intellectual superiority. Political consulting and strategic communication are essential components of democratic discourse. Any attempt to regulate or restrict these activities would chill free speech and prevent candidates from effectively communicating their messages to voters. Rove's voice took on a patronizing tone as he warmed to his theme. "I fear that some members of this committee may not fully grasp the complexities involved in modern political campaigns. These are sophisticated operations requiring years of experience and deep understanding of electoral dynamics." When Crockett's turn came to question the witness, her approach was methodical and prosecutorial. "Mr. Rove, thank you for appearing today. I want to ask you about your history of negative campaigning and what some critics have called voter suppression tactics. Specifically, your role in spreading false information about Democratic candidates and your efforts to restrict voting access in minority communities." Rove's response was immediate and condescending. "Congresswoman, I think you may be confusing legitimate political strategy with conspiracy theories promoted by your party. Opposition research and voter education are fundamental aspects of democratic competition." The dismissal was calculated to put Crockett on the defensive, but she pressed forward. "Mr. Rove, you've made millions of dollars developing strategies that many argue have undermined democratic participation. How do you justify profiting from tactics that make it harder for ordinary Americans to have their voices heard?" The question struck at the heart of Rove's career, and his mask began to slip. "Congresswoman, perhaps someone with your background wouldn't understand the sophisticated nature of modern political communication." The phrase hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The gallery fell silent as everyone recognized that Rove had just crossed a line, making a class-based attack that revealed his true feelings about working-class politicians who dared to question his authority. Rove pressed his attack, confident that he had found Crockett's vulnerability and could exploit it to discredit her questions. What I mean, Congresswoman, is that political strategy requires a certain level of sophistication and experience that comes from being involved in high-stakes campaigns at the national level. His voice took on the tone of a professor lecturing a particularly slow student. Someone who has spent their career in local politics and community organizing might not fully appreciate the complex calculations involved in presidential campaigns and major political movements. The insult was carefully crafted to sound intellectual rather than personal, but everyone in the room understood its true meaning. Rove was suggesting that Crockett's working-class background made her unqualified to question someone of his stature and experience. Crockett's response was measured and direct. "Mr. Rove, I appreciate your assessment of my qualifications, but let me ask you about something specific. In 2004, your strategies included voter caging operations that targeted predominantly minority neighborhoods. These operations resulted in eligible voters being removed from registration rolls. How does that serve democratic participation?" The question caught Rove off guard. He had expected his class-based attack to intimidate Crockett into retreat, not prompt her to present specific evidence of his controversial tactics. "Those are allegations that have been thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit," Rove replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "What you're describing is standard voter file maintenance that ensures election integrity." Standard maintenance? Crockett's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Rove, these operations disproportionately targeted neighborhoods where people like me grew up. Working-class communities where families struggled to maintain stable addresses, where people moved frequently due to economic necessity." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You exploited housing instability, the very challenges that working families face, to remove them from voter rolls. How is that protecting democracy?" The room's energy shifted as Crockett began connecting Rove's abstract political strategies to their real-world impact on vulnerable communities. The gallery, which had been uncomfortable with Rove's class-based attacks, now leaned forward as they recognized the moral dimensions of the confrontation. Rove's face reddened as he realized his opponent was more formidable than he had anticipated. "Congresswoman, you're mischaracterizing routine election administration as some kind of conspiracy." "Am I?" Crockett interrupted. "Because according to these documents from the Department of Justice, your voter caging operations removed over 300,000 eligible voters from rolls in swing states, with 78% of those removals occurring in low-income neighborhoods." She held up a thick folder. "These aren't allegations, Mr. Rove. These are documented facts about how your strategies directly undermined the voting rights of people who looked like me, who grew up like me, who faced the same challenges my family faced." The moment that began Rove's destruction came when he made the catastrophic mistake of doubling down on his personal attacks, providing Crockett with the opening she needed to turn his weapon against him. "Congresswoman, I think your emotional attachment to these issues may be clouding your judgment," Rove said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps your own experiences with housing instability and economic hardship make it difficult for you to view these matters objectively." The attack was breathtaking in its cruelty and stupidity. Rove had just used Crockett's childhood struggles, periods when her family had faced eviction and food insecurity, as a weapon against her, suggesting that her background disqualified her from understanding political strategy. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs as the full impact of Rove's words sank in. Even his supporters looked uncomfortable with the naked classism of his attack. He had crossed a line that revealed the ugly elitism at the heart of his worldview. Crockett sat perfectly still for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she began to speak, her voice quiet but carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Mr. Rove, thank you for that response. You're absolutely right. My experiences with housing instability and economic hardship do shape my perspective on these issues." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "When I was 8 years old, my family was evicted from our apartment because my mother lost her job. We spent 3 weeks living in our car while she looked for work. During that time, we couldn't receive mail at a consistent address." The room fell into complete silence as Crockett's personal story began to unfold. "Do you know what that means in practical terms, Mr. Rove? It means we couldn't update our voter registration. It means that when my mother tried to vote in the next election, she discovered she had been purged from rolls due to an undeliverable address." The connection between personal experience and political consequence was devastating in its clarity. Rove sat frozen as he realized that his attempt to weaponize Crockett's background had instead given her moral authority that he could never match. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments of authentic leadership in American political history. Crockett stood up, her voice rising with the authority that comes from lived experience rather than inherited privilege. "Mr. Rove, you asked whether my background affects my judgment. Let me tell you exactly how it affects my judgment," she began, her words carrying the weight of personal testimony and moral conviction. "My experiences with housing instability taught me that the right to vote shouldn't depend on having a stable address. My family's struggles with food insecurity taught me that democracy only works when everyone has a voice, not just those who can afford political consultants." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate, as she connected her personal story to broader principles of justice and representation. "You see, Mr. Rove, what you view as a weakness, my working-class background, I view as a qualification. Because I understand in my bones what it means when political operatives develop strategies that silence ordinary Americans." She picked up the folder of documents. "These voter caging operations you designed didn't just remove names from databases. They removed mothers like mine who were working 2 jobs to keep their families housed. They removed fathers who moved frequently because they couldn't afford stable rent. They removed students who changed addresses when they went to college." The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of her voice. Cameras captured every word as she delivered what would become one of the most quoted speeches in congressional history. "You profit from chaos, Mr. Rove. You make millions of dollars creating systems that keep working people powerless while convincing wealthy donors that their interests are more important than democratic participation." Her voice cracked with emotion as she continued. "But here's what you don't understand, and what your privileged background prevents you from seeing. The people you've spent decades suppressing aren't victims. We're survivors. And survivors don't stay silent when confronted with bullies." Rove tried to interrupt, but Crockett held up her hand and kept speaking, her voice rising to fill the entire chamber. "You want to talk about qualifications? I'll tell you about qualifications. Every night I spent hungry taught me about the cost of political indifference. Every time my family moved because we couldn't make rent taught me about the vulnerability of working families. Every barrier I faced taught me about the systems that are designed to keep people like me from sitting in rooms like this." She looked directly at Rove, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "My upbringing didn't disqualify me from questioning your methods. It gave me the moral authority to expose them. Because I know exactly what it costs when political operatives treat democracy like a game and ordinary Americans like pawns." The silence that followed was deafening. Rove sat completely motionless, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow expression of a man whose worldview had just been shattered by someone he had tried to diminish. Crockett's final words cut through the silence like a sword. "The difference between us, Mr. Rove, is that you were born on third base and think you hit a triple. I started in the batter's box, and I earned every step to home plate." Within seconds, social media exploded with unprecedented emotional intensity. Hashtag Crockett Power Speech and hashtag Rove Destroyed began trending worldwide as video clips of her testimony were shared millions of times across every platform. The moment when she connected her childhood homelessness to voter suppression became an instant symbol of authentic American resilience confronting elite political manipulation. News networks across the political spectrum dedicated extensive coverage to the confrontation. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend Rove's performance, with several noting that his class-based attacks had backfired spectacularly and revealed an ugly side of political elitism. Progressive leaders hailed Crockett's testimony as a masterclass in turning personal experience into political power. The impact extended far beyond politics into American cultural discourse. Her speech became required viewing in political science courses and communication programs. Civil rights organizations began using clips of her testimony in their advocacy campaigns, while working-class advocacy groups adopted her words as rallying cries for political inclusion. Rove's reputation suffered immediate and lasting damage. His consulting firm lost several high-profile clients within days as political operatives recognized that association with his brand of elitist politics had become toxic. Several Republican politicians distanced themselves from his methods, acknowledging that his approach was out of step with modern American values. The confrontation accelerated national conversations about class, representation, and authentic leadership that had been building for years. Crockett's office was flooded with letters from working families sharing their own stories of resilience and determination. In the weeks that followed, political analysts would debate what had made Crockett's response so devastating. Some pointed to her legal training and ability to connect personal narrative to policy consequences. Others emphasized how she had transformed Rove's attack into a demonstration of moral authority. But the real power of the moment lay in its authenticity. It had shown America what genuine representation looked like when contrasted with privileged manipulation. For too long, American politics had been dominated by operatives who viewed working-class backgrounds as vulnerabilities to be exploited rather than sources of strength and insight. Rove had embodied this arrogance, believing that his elite education and wealthy connections made him superior to politicians who had actually experienced the struggles faced by ordinary Americans. Crockett had shattered that entire framework by demonstrating that lived experience was more valuable than inherited privilege. As she said in the interviews that followed, democracy isn't about protecting the comfortable, it's about amplifying the voices of those who have been silenced. Today, we reminded everyone that authentic leadership comes from understanding struggle, not from avoiding it. The confrontation would be remembered as a watershed moment in American political discourse, the day when authentic experience triumphed over artificial authority and